Okay, welcome back from the break, everyone. My name is Bharat Ganesh. I'm an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Groningen. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I was very delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Jillian York. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to Jillian and her work, and then continue with, of course, Jillian's presentation. So Jillian C. York is a leading writer and activist whose work examines the impact of technology on our societal and cultural values. Jillian is a director for international freedom of expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a fellow at the Center for Internet and Human Rights at the European University Viadrina, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe, Natolin. Jillian's latest book, Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism, was published by Verso this year. In it, Jillian stitches a compelling, powerful account of platform surveillance and control over free expression across the planet. Silicon Values is not only a path-breaking work in understanding the power of platforms in current struggles over freedom of expression, it contributes instructive global perspectives on how to defend freedom of expression in the face of corporate control, rising authoritarianism, and cultures of hate. Just one of many powerful quotes in Silicon Values, this one resonated with me quite a bit. The following, I think, sets the stage for the challenges that Jillian lays out in the book. Jillian writes, "We've now firmly reached an era where it can no longer be said, if it ever could, that the internet is a space where anyone, anywhere may express their beliefs, but one in which groups already marginalized by society are further victimized by unaccountable platforms, and the already powerful are free to spread misinformation with hate or impunity. Welcome to dystopia." I hope you will all join me in providing a warm welcome to Jillian York, and very much looking forward to this keynote.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. I speak without slides. I hope that's all right for everyone. And I'm really just going to kind of tell a story here. And we'll give some policy recommendations, of course, but I've been listening so far and I've heard some really excellent ones. So just to give you my framing, I'm coming at this from kind of an activist background rather than a policy one. So I guess I'll start by just asking, how did we get to the point that we're at with technology, with the control that's exerted by a handful of corporations over our everyday communications and the ways that we interact, the ways that we create, and all of this online? So I would start by just giving you a short excerpt. I think everyone's familiar with this, but of the California ideology that was posed by Barber and Cameron in 1995, described as kind of a new faith, a bizarre fusion of the cultural bohemianism of San Francisco with the high-tech industries of Silicon Valley. And what emerged from that, in my view, is this really unique culture that's unique to the United States, to Silicon Valley, that has enabled these what has been called the new governors, or Rebecca McKinnon is referred to as the Sultan of Facebookistan, Mark Zuckerberg, these unelected rulers that have extraordinary control over our privacy, our freedom of expression, and a number of our other rights as time has moved on. So when these companies emerged, we're talking about, of course, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, all of these different platforms in which we, spend a lot of our time these days, whether on our phones or on our laptops, on our desktops. When these emerged about, I guess we're looking at almost 20 years ago now, 15 years ago, they were seen as really a place of promise. 2006, I think it was the year, where Time magazine named you as the person of the year, reflecting upon the role that YouTube had played in enabling people to share their personal lives and their stories with the world. And it was really kind of an exciting time. This is the same time that I was personally coming up on the internet. And I'm going to share a story to just kind of let you know how I got to the work that I ended up doing. In 2005, just a year before that Time magazine profile came out, I had moved to Morocco to teach English, as one does, when you're young and have no idea what you want to do with your life. And when I got there, I was using a platform that may be familiar to you, but called LiveJournal. blogging platform, maybe seen as kind of more of a diary back then. But regardless, I went to log into my LiveJournal profile on my very first day there to let people know that I'd arrived safely and that my apartment was nice and all of these things. And when I went to the URL, typed it in, I got a 404 error. And I'd never seen a 404 error before, or at least not like this. I'd grown up in the US in a time where there was not blocking of websites. There were domain seizures, of course. I knew about Napster and the things that had happened with that. But for the most part, the internet seemed like an unregulated Wild West. And that was by intent in a lot of ways. But the view from Morocco was different. The internet there was restricted. There were kind of 3 topics that were off limits, and the government had put in place structures to restrict these websites from being viewed. And that was things that criticized the king, the royal family, criticized Islam, and criticized the occupation of the Western Sahara. And so these taboos, which were also restricted in traditional media, were blocked online. So LiveJournal had become one of these places where people talked about taboo issues, and therefore it became blocked. Of course, this was really my first experience with direct internet censorship in this way, and it got me really intrigued. What kind of power could governments assert over our online spaces, over this space that I had always considered to be kind of a free and international space? And I mean, don't get me wrong, the internet for me has been an incredible journey. It's enabled my career, but it's also brought some of my closest friendships. I've met partners through the internet. I've met collaborators through the internet and across international borders. And so for me, that first encounter with censorship was really striking because it's how I had found my job in Morocco in the first place. So at that time, this again, 2005, just before the emergence of what we now know as social media. This was when blogs were popular. And as Facebook and YouTube and these other platforms began to become popular and emerge over the world, spread throughout different countries before these offices were even created, a lot of governments saw the threat that they posed early on and blocked them. And this is kind of a forgotten history because as we're seeing right now, with this battle between, say, Twitter and India, Turkey and Facebook, et cetera, I think these are, kind of familiar headlines to most people. This all kind of happened more than a decade ago as well. Between the years of 2006 and 2010, I believe something like 10 different countries blocked access to either Facebook or YouTube. This includes Turkey, Pakistan, Tunisia, Syria, a handful of other places, but really kind of a range of different countries and different rationale. Thailand, that's another one to name one a little bit further afield. And so, these governments saw some potential in these platforms, and sure enough, a few years later, we would see these platforms utilized for revolution, for social change. Everyone kind of points to Iran as being one of the big places where this started, but actually the 2009 Green Revolution there was not so much kind of the first Twitter revolution as the media portrayed it. There was actually a number of earlier incidents where social media had permitted social change as well. We saw this in Tunisia, despite the blocks, in Morocco, the capturing of police violence, et cetera, But it was really 2011 that struck social media into the hearts and minds of everyone as this really strong catalyst for change. First, again, Tunisia, and then Egypt. We saw these uprisings occur, mobilized, really, not created, but mobilized through social media. And of course, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to have time to do that in this talk. But one of the things that really strikes me about that is there's this one little somewhat untold story, but I do tell it in my book, and I'm not the first to do so. I can't take credit for it, but I was involved with it. And so I'll share it with you today. Just a handful of months, I think 2 or 3 months before the January 25th uprising that toppled Mubarak in Egypt, there was a page that on Facebook that was the one that eventually called for that uprising to happen. So this page was called We Are All Khaled Said. And in November of 2010, that page was erased by Facebook. And I find that story fascinating because it sort of pretends like this revolution that may not have happened were it not for Facebook. Now, of course, I think it may have happened anyway. I think that there are a lot of other ways to get that word out there, but nevertheless, Facebook had the power to restrict that site. And why? It wasn't because of the Egyptian government. It was because of their own rules that they had put in place. And that rule was their rule against anonymity. And so the administrators of that page, Egyptian, were trying to, not put their lives at risk by using pseudonyms on Facebook to advertise for a revolution. Totally reasonable choice, and yet Facebook saw that as Mark Zuckerberg had described in his, in later interviews, as kind of I'm not going to quote him accurately here, but a lack of dignity or a lack of integrity. That's the word that he used in using more than one identity. So his vision of the world, and that's really where I want to kind of grow this out, that Mark Zuckerberg's vision of the world did not include using a different identity than the one on your ID card. And that policy still holds today. And I think that that's a really illustrative example of the kind of power that these companies exert over our expression. Because anonymity has a long history in the world, as being important for politics, important for art. Whether we're talking about Banksy or the political participation in Athens, in ancient Athens, we know that anonymity is key to political life and art and artistry, and yet one guy in California says it's not, and therefore, that sort of changes the paradigm of what we're allowed to do online, and we're seeing this come up in regulations as well. And so 2011, just kind of framing it back there, 2011, brought about all this promise of these platforms, and we did see a lot of different social movements grow because of social media. And I think that that's important to remember as we think about how to regulate it going forward or what we want it to do, because as much as it has also enabled disinformation campaigns, propaganda, harassment, and all of these other things to thrive, it has also enabled us to share with the world our ideas about how to change the world. And yet, that same power in the hands of people that we support can also be incredibly negative. And so in the years after 2011, what we saw was, as war happened in Syria, as counter-revolutions occurred elsewhere, as the rise of populism, the rise of movements like Gamergate, 2014, I would say, between 2014 and 2016, really saw kind of a power shift and an acceptance of the role that these social media companies played. And this, I would posit, is the result of increased government pressure, increased social and public pressure on these companies to kind of do more about these various societal ills. And what they mean by do more is ultimately censor. And I use the word censorship as kind of value neutral. It doesn't necessarily mean, that it's something that we think is negative. There's positive censorship too, right? Like, we don't want to see child sexual abuse imagery on the web, and yet by taking away the word censorship to apply to that, I think that we kind of give it a power that it doesn't deserve. And so when I talk about censorship, I mean censorship of the things that we think should be censored and censorship of the things that we don't think should be censored. And so, 2014 really saw kind of a societal acceptance of this power that these companies had. Back when I used to talk about this topic, I would, around 2011, 2012, and I would talk about the accidental or overbroad censorship of marginalized communities on social media platforms. I would get a lot of pushback, especially in the US, but not only, from people who said, but these are private companies. Don't they have the right to do what they want to do? And the truth is that, legally speaking, they do have that right. In the US, we've given them, broad immunity from liability, but that's actually not the regulation that applies here. It's actually the First Amendment in the US that gives companies the right to censor things. And I know that that's sort of counterintuitive to a lot of Europeans and folks elsewhere, and to me, honestly, as well, coming at this from first principles. The idea that a corporation has First Amendment rights to censor other people's speech, really baffling, and yet that is the role that these companies play and the rules that they play by. So, all of that said, that power shift occurs. These companies gain more power. They start planting offices in places like Dubai, in the Philippines. They start outsourcing more and more of their content moderation practices and labor to various countries around the world, mostly in the global south, mostly not well paid, mostly through third-party contractors, and largely not given the mental health support that they need. And so what we have now, and this has only gotten worse over time, is a scenario in which the world's poorest are censoring the web so that those of us in the global north don't have to see these horrible things. And with that, comes a movement and more awareness of this issue, and thus the companies respond by applying more automation to this practice of content moderation. And so that's really where we are now. We have very little agency. We're living with these platforms. They're a key part of our lives. And yet we don't have much transparency, to bring back a word that's come up quite a bit, and I'll address that in a moment. But we don't have transparency into how these algorithms and AI work. We don't know what the inputs look like. We don't know what kinds of human biases are brought into the process of moderation. And at the same time, we also don't have any real insight or participation into the creation of the rules. So whereas historically laws have been created in democratic societies with input, for better or worse, I know it's not always the case that we really get to have a say in our laws, but for better or worse, in a democratic society, the people do play a role in the lawmaking process. And yet with these companies, we play no role. There have been a few interesting experiments, for example, where Twitter asked the public to weigh in on how a certain rule should happen. This happened with their dehumanization policy, for example. But by and large, we don't get to say whether or not Facebook bans nudity or bans anonymity. And so these again, going back to the kind of California ideology, these platforms have basically their CEOs and executive teams have basically created a scenario where they are the unelected rulers. They're the kings. They're the lawmakers. They're judge and jury. And that's the point at which we're at now. And so what needs to change? I think that we should really start at a point of asking some questions, because what I've seen over the past couple of years is a flurry of regulations, many of which do not take into account the world's most marginalized users. And I'm looking mostly at the US when I say this, but I'm also looking at Germany and some of the other countries that have put into place liability for these platforms that does not actually reduce harm, but simply hides things from view, again, using low-paid workers. I don't think that that's the solution to our problems, and I think that we have to look at root causes. So the questions that I think that we need to be asking are, how do we put the control back in the hands of the people, the users? I don't really love the term user, but that is who we are. We use these platforms, whether we're using them for art, for communication. We're people, ultimately. And so let's put control back in the hands of the users. How do we do that? How can we limit harm? And because there are real harms here, whether we're talking about human trafficking, child sexual abuse imagery, the trafficking of endangered species, which is a thing that actually is happening on Facebook, or our archaeological history. There's antiquities being traded on these platforms, as I read in a recent report. So how can we limit harm without also creating harm for marginalized communities? And again, I want to emphasize that. I haven't talked about it in so much detail, although I'm happy to take questions. I want to emphasize that because what I've seen in the past decade of doing this work is that the people who are most harmed by this overbroad censorship that exists on these platforms are marginalized and vulnerable communities. And so we have to find some sort of balance here, because what we see, for example, when there are rules put in place around terrorist and violent extremist content, we've seen the erasure of history. So there are people doing work to archive, human rights violations and war in Syria, in Libya, and those, uploading those videos to YouTube in the hopes that someone will see them and archive them. There's this incredible project in Berlin called Syrian Archive, which is doing that work, collecting these crowdsourced videos from throughout the web and making sure that they remain preserved. But because of the policies of these companies, they often get erased and just thrown in the trash, not preserved, not documented, before they even have a chance to be used. Why is this important? Why do we need this video content? Well, we've already seen trials in The Hague where where content sourced from Facebook has been used in a successful prosecution of a Libyan military general. And so we do know that this serves a purpose, and that purpose is higher than the concerns that these companies have. But it's not just that, it's also our sexual expression, our expression as humans, our expression of art, of identity. Again, the policies that Facebook has around nudity in the human body are so restrictive that in some cases they restrict conversations about breast cancer awareness. In some instances, they restrict artistic expression, including the high arts. And so, again, like, who should determine what that is? I think that that's a valid or a less valid question, but regardless, these companies should not be exerting that kind of power to make those determinations. And so on the more practical side, because I realize I'm kind of coming close to my time here, what needs to change? So let me give you my kind of short list of things that I would like to see happen. Again, I'm not as in depth into policy as the folks that we heard from earlier, and so I definitely would refer you to them for that work, and we do work closely with EDRI and some of these other groups. But first of all, transparency. I very much agree with what Evelyn said earlier, that there's too much focus on transparency, and that in fact some of these transparency reports from companies, which are not mandated but are kind of made voluntarily, and I'd say voluntarily, almost coerced from these platforms, that they've actually maybe engendered more censorship over the years. And I've written a piece about that. I think that it is a fair argument to make. But nevertheless, we do want transparency from these platforms. And perhaps that's something that we need to see pushed through regulation. We have this initiative called the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability and Content Moderation, which right now focus on 3 areas. Numbers, which I think were spoken about earlier, kind of producing or forcing these companies to produce information about their error rates and things like that, how many content moderators they have working in a specific language, etc. But also things like notice, just giving users ample notice when they violate a rule and what they can do to remedy that. You'd be really surprised to learn, or perhaps you wouldn't be if you're a heavy user of these platforms, how little information users are given about their own accounts and their own mistakes. And so you could be a Facebook user for 15 years and then one day accidentally cross a rule that you may not even have known existed. And this is, again, I'm happy to answer questions about that in detail. Cross that line, you don't understand what the rules are, and you could lose your account, your entire life history on that platform, just by violating one rule. There's not always a second strike. It doesn't always work that way. And I think that that's really important to remember, just in terms of how much power these companies exert. Now, of course, some people might say, why does that really matter? Does it really matter if I lose access to Facebook? There's plenty of other places I can go on the web, but I think we all know at this point that that's not really true. I'm not a heavy Facebook user, but I do have platforms that I use that rely on the Facebook login, Spotify, for example. And so I think that, let's consider the role that these platforms might play in other people's lives, even if they're not that important to us. But moving on from that, so there's transparency, accountability, of course, and I think that there's real accountability measures that need to happen. Remedy, though, this is another really important one to me, that these companies often don't provide a path of recourse, and we know that due process and remedy are really important procedures in law, in human rights, and so we should be looking to ensure that these companies have appeals processes. Very basic, and yet most of them don't, at least not full scale. Human contact, customer service. It really strikes me that in the United States, customer service is such a key component of life. I don't know if there are, other folks from there listening, or if you've spent time there, but that, you sit down at a restaurant and you're given this whole spiel about, have you been here before? What would you like to eat? Do you have any, all of these questions? And yet you go on Facebook and you can never encounter a person if you come across an error or you lose your account. That's really wild to me, and I think that that's really unique to Silicon Valley ideology, and that's something that needs to change. I'm realizing I'm running out of time, so I'll just try to get through the rest of these and then answer some questions. Interoperability, this is something that we're pushing for within the Digital Services Act in Europe, but also perhaps in the US through regulation. We're calling it, I always mess this up, competitive compatibility, or COMCOM. This is Cory Doctorow's phrase. He's really the expert on this. I can't speak about it as eloquently as him, but the idea that we should have the ability to empower users and innovators through interoperability, I really support that. And we want to see users have more control too. So algorithmic justice is a really popular conversation right now, and I think that there's a number of different components to that play a role in various parts of our lives. But when it comes to content moderation specifically, why is it that we should have companies making centralized decisions about our speech? Why not instead put power in the hands of users to determine what they see in their feeds and what sorts of things they're comfortable with? So if I'm comfortable seeing nudity, why can't I just flip a switch that says, here that is? If we're using automation to classify these things, and that's how it does work, then presumably that same automation that can be used to censor something out of your feed could also be put in your hands to say, I'm okay with seeing nudity, or for that matter, I'm okay with seeing cats and dogs. And finally, procedural justice. Again, this comes back to remedy and appeals, but I think that there's a lot of other components to it as well. And we being, sort of collective civil society, there's a lot of people right now, a lot of organizations throughout the world that are really pushing on these companies to bring inclusion, to bring people into the process. And by people, I mean civil society throughout the world, throughout the global south, to have them play a role in the rulemaking process and in these decisions. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's really what we need to do to stop creating so much harm for the most vulnerable communities throughout the world, and to bring human rights frameworks into these platforms as well. I know that there's initiatives like the Facebook Oversight Board, which I've been very critical of, but which is still really interesting. If you look at their actual decisions, looked at from afar, from kind of the bird's eye view, I'm not very impressed, but looking closer, you can see that they've already started putting out recommendations to the company to institute human rights into its basic frameworks. There's a lot more work to do, though, and I think that this is where regulation comes in. This is where we need to educate our lawmakers to ensure that they are looking at these questions about protecting vulnerable communities and putting users in control, rather than just placing the emphasis on liability for platforms. That may be one tool, but I don't think it's the best tool that we have. And I think that we need to look more closely at these questions and at the root causes of some of our societal ills before we just slap the kind of ban hammer on various types of speech. So thanks for coming to my talk, and I would love to discuss this with you further.
Okay, Jillian, thank you very much for your talk. I think there's many things for us to digest and think about, and I think also it's really nice to hear that kind of concrete set of steps that we might consider taking. I'm sure we have plenty of questions for the audience, so without any delay, let's move right on to that. I thought we would start with a question from Aryan. Aryan asks, he says, I'd be curious to hear Jillian's response to people connecting the hostile atmosphere on social media platforms to the fact that people can interact there under a username, not under their own name, and act in an anonymous way. Also, and maybe related, freedom of speech is something that nowadays is also seen as something that maybe mostly gives power to the ones that already have a voice and already have power. So have these developments and opinions changed the way, Jillian, that you see your work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation and your own work as an activist and an author?
That's a fantastic set of questions. I'm going to try to keep track of them all in my head as I go. So when it comes to anonymity versus usernames, I think that this is kind of an age-old question. The internet was really built on a foundation of self-identification, and I feel very strongly in the importance of preserving the right to, if not anonymity, then pseudonymity, the right to not having to identify as the name with which you were born. And I think that we need to get into these nitty-gritty details and make these distinctions. Because when we talk about this, it so often gets thrown into this kind of binary conversation of like, oh, anonymity is bad, it enables these terrible actors. But at the same time, there's this incredible piece, which I read this week on a platform called Rest of World, which talked about Iraqi women who are using pseudonyms online to participate in conversations that they otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to because they would be at risk of doing so. And I think it's always important to remember that there are people who are at risk if they go online with their real name. It's not just that, and that's where those nitty-gritty details are important. What is a real name? Is it the name your parents gave you? Is it the name that exists on your identity card? For a large and growing number of people, that's just not the case. Whether a person is transgender or they just simply change their name, these platforms have a very rigid definition of what constitutes identity. I think that is often in cooperation with states, which want to be able to track you and other movements. And I don't mean to sound paranoid when I say that, but we know this reality. Use of facial recognition and other ID checks and things like that. So I think it's simply a matter of whether anonymity is bad or rather balancing harm. And so can we create environments where you're encouraged to use something that looks like a name, perhaps, but you don't have to identify your precise ID name. And, I think that another important consideration here too is whether or not using a real name really does enable civility. And I think what we see in politics in the past few years is that that's not really true. There's plenty of people who harass people online using their real names, plenty of famous people who do this. If you look at media Twitter, you can see this all the time. If you look at Donald Trump, you can see this, and I'm pretty sure that is his real name. So I think that's something that should be challenged, an idea that using our real names makes us more civil. As to the question on free speech, I'll be honest, and I said this in my book too, my views on this have changed over the years. I was much more of an absolutist in my early days, but I also think that this comes from the background that I was working in. I think a lot of people have been frustrated or were frustrated with my work in those earlier days because of the way that I came across. I'm American. It does come across as kind of a First Amendment perspective, but all of the work that I did in the early days was working on human rights defenders in the Middle East and North Africa, who are often, at grave risk in terms of state censorship and in terms of surveillance as well. And so when I think about free expression and its importance, I'm often thinking about those folks and there are other people like them around the world. And yet at the same time, I have changed my views when it comes to things like harassment. I recognize that harassment can, in fact, create a culture of censorship and self-censorship. And so there is a balance to be found. And I'm not in any way against platforms banning people who harass, banning people who spread propaganda, knowingly spread disinformation. But at the same time, I think that these definitions and hate speech as well have become too expansive to the point where Twitter, kind of considers the F word as hate speech. And that to me is absolutely absurd.
Great, thank you, Jillian. I think we have another question that I think follows kind of logically from this one, and especially with this kind of issue about free speech, those in power. And I think it's again important to stress the research really shows that anonymity is no guarantee of civility at all. But we've also seen, of course, particular kinds of claims about free speech being really mobilized by the right at the moment. And so we have another question that's come in about that. Jillian, you mentioned that platforms have the tyrannical power to remove an entire history without an appeals process. And so building on this kind of point, an audience member has asked, yesterday Trump showed up on blogger Dave Rubin's channel to gripe about big tech censorship. Their question is, how do progressives prevent the right from co-opting this issue, as, for example, they have done with free speech? And I believe it was Mark Tutors who's asked that question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and something that I've spent a lot of time fighting back against and trying to think about too. Really, when like I said, like in the early days when I was giving talks like this, I would get a lot of pushback of like, oh, these are private companies, they can do whatever they want. And that was from liberals and conservatives alike in the US. And it's interesting to me to see the shift over time to some of the people who would normally defend, and again, like this may be very American, but people who would normally defend the right of a company to discriminate. So, as we know with like the wedding cake Supreme Court decision, those same people who would defend that are also crying censorship in this case. And so what I always point out here is that this history goes back so much further, and that the slippery slope does not go in the direction that people say it does. It's not like, oh no, if you censor the Nazis from marching in Skokie, then the progressives aren't going to be able to march. No, it's the other way around. It's always marginalized communities that are censored first, and we have to keep that in mind, and we always have to bring that up again and again, because I've been seeing over the past few years, progressives grow increasingly comfortable with censorship that I'm not comfortable with. And again, maybe that's more in the US than elsewhere, but I think we see it here too, in Europe, with the way that we have selective definitions of which atrocities are censored and which ones are free to question. I think that that's problematic as well. If you want to ban, genocide denial, ban it wholesale. Don't ban it about one specific instance. And so, anyway, just back to the question, I think that, I think we have to remember why free expression is important, and that's because authorities, right? Authorities change, they shift. So we might be comfortable with this particular authority censoring something. We might trust them to do that job. But if we live in a democracy, we know that politics can shift and change. And we know that the next person in power may use that law in a different, unjust way. And so we have to be very careful when we decide to restrict something. And that's why we have these human rights frameworks. That's why they exist. It is okay to inhibit certain, incitement, for example. But I think that we should question any censorship that goes beyond genuine harm. And that's where I think progressives need to take back that narrative and remind people whose voices are really being silenced. It's not, it's by and large not conservatives. I'm not saying they're never subject to censorship. It happens to them too, but it happens to marginalized communities first.
Great, thank you for that. I think to add on to this point, more broadly, right? We have. I think in your book, your work really, and your arguments about this really center the perspectives of those who are harmed. And I think that's one of the perspectives when it comes to the production of the creation of laws and the kinds of regulations that we're seeing. Those are exactly the kinds of voices that are still not being brought to the table, either by governments or by these tech companies that I think you've highlighted, and many others in this field have done as well. I have one question. I'm going to maybe abuse my power here as moderator, but I think it's quite important. I'd like to revisit this kind of question of liabilities, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about how to deal with extremism online. Questions about algorithmic reach are really important, and you make an interesting point about in your book about freedom of reach. But I'm curious, do we move forward in a way where we avoid regulations, right? If we're not doing these kind of, let's say, NetzDG style regulations that are about content takedown, what are the kinds of ways that governments and civil society should try to put pressure on platforms? Is kind of liability around algorithmic reach, is that something that you think is the right way to go? Or do you think that, maybe we're having the wrong conversation about regulation? It has to be much more about solving the problems that are at the root of these kinds of issues that we see?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for abusing your privilege on that one, because I like this one a lot. So first of all, I think that the first thing that we have to do is address the root causes. Social problems are not solved by censorship. They might be pushed aside. They might be, you might be given a little bit more time to work with, but we don't solve societal ills for the most part with censorship. And we know this. We see that when we ban extremists from certain platforms, they crop up on other ones. We know about, things like the Streisand effect. And of course, deplatforming is successful in certain circumstances. It got Milo Yiannopoulos off the web, yay. But at the same time, I don't think that as a long-term strategy, that's going to work. And we can see the people that get riled up by these deplatformings, gain power after that. And so I think that Trumpism, for example, is just kind of beginning, and that maybe we remove that figurehead, but that isn't going to change the core problem. And so we need to think about education from the very beginning. We need to think about, civic education, civic duty. We need to kind of reframe society and even, upend our economic systems. Wink, wink. But yeah, I think that, that doesn't mean that there's no role for regulation. And I think that some of the ideas that we're seeing put forth from Bits of Freedom, from EDRI, from EFF, from all of these different organizations around regulating things like interoperability, competition, empowering users through choice, procedural justice, enforcing human rights frameworks into the frameworks that these companies use for their rule sets. All of these things could be effective ideas for regulation. The reason that I kind of hedge on this is because I'm not convinced that these ideas are going to come from me, and I'm actually very concerned about the idea that Americans and Europeans are making these decisions in ways that are going to impact the rest of the world. So however we do this, we have to bring the rest of the world into the conversation.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important warning almost, right? That if we keep proceeding in the way we are, that these laws really only speak to a certain area and a certain geography, and the process itself becomes exclusionary. I think we've got time for just one more question, and I think it's a kind of a nice one to end on. Ariane asks another question, which is, which artists or art projects do you know of that have inspired this discussion on digital agency and brought it into the public debate and the attention of wider audiences? Why do you think that any project that you might draw on would be a good example of that? I think that will dovetail nicely with the following session as well.
Sure. Well, there's quite a few that I can think of, but one of my favorite art projects / campaigns recently was done by the National Coalition Against Censorship in the United States, which is a pretty small and agile organization based in New York. They're the ones who did the topless protest in front of Facebook's New York headquarters, which I just think was adorable, artistic, but also really powerful. But what they're doing right now is advocating for the rights of artists on Facebook to be able to have a livelihood, to be able to share their work, regardless of whether their work crosses certain sexual boundaries. And I think that that's really, really important. And as we've seen during the pandemic, in particular, people's livelihoods are affected when they get kicked off these platforms. I do a lot of work around the rights of sex workers, but I think that the rights of sex workers and the rights of artists really coalesce here. And so I think that this work being done around sexual expression online is really key because we are seeing such a closing space around that. So that to me is such a really good example of, bringing back people's agency on these social platforms.
Okay, well, I think we should leave it there. Jillian, thank you very much for this discussion, your answers, and all of your thoughts today. Yes, to everyone in the audience, I really encourage you pick up Jillian's book. It's a really wonderful read and really quite informative. But yes, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you. You too.